Political parties and voters are preparing for what many experts say will be South Africa's most fiercely contested election to date. The country's elections have been dominated by the ANC, which assumed power during the landmark 1994 general elections. Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. The governing party has consistently dominated elections, falling short of gaining two-thirds majority in 1999 with a massive 65.9% of the vote. Latest opinion polls and surveys show a dramatic decline in support for the ANC, however. And so tonight we ask the question on everyone's lips: will the ANC fall below 50%? And to help me unpack this topic, I'm joined by a series of experts, pollsters, academics, and various insightful voices. Firstly, we have Professor David Everatt from the WITS School of Governance, independent political analyst Ms. Khanyi Magubane, Mr. Tselane, who is the executive chairperson of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, and on Zoom I'm joined by Mr. Ray Hartley, who is research director at the Brenthurst Foundation. Mr. Tselane, could I start with you to just set the scene in this first segment as we look at how elections have gone up to this point? How do you characterize this election in South Africa's electoral history? And do you think there's anything special about this election that the IEC and election managers will have to consider?
Of course, there are quite a number of issues. Firstly, as you correctly pointed out, that we have reached a point in the history of South Africa where you no longer have one dominant political party. If you look at how political parties performed in the last local government elections, particularly in the metros, you begin to realize that the days of one dominant political party are over. So it is significant, therefore, because every political party believes that they can actually be able to make a difference by being part of a coalition of some sort. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is an atmosphere of nervousness, anxiety about these elections. It's almost like in 1994, where there was a lot of uncertainty. Quite a number of political parties and individuals are even testing and asking whether the commission will have the capacity to manage these elections with integrity. And it's an important point that has been raised, and hopefully the commission will be able to conduct these elections in a manner that it is smooth, credible, and it is run with integrity, like all other elections have happened in the past.
Can I ask you if you're confident of that, given your history within the IEC and your expertise in many different elections? I'm
confident about two things. One, firstly, the systems that have been put in place, the transparency thereof. If anything untoward was to happen, everybody would actually be able to see that there is something irregular here that has actually happened. And that transparency will still remain going into these elections. And then the second aspect is that the commission is constituted by people who've been there for a long time. So there is a pool of expertise at a local level everywhere that have run these elections. And I'm sure they all understand the importance of this moment in the history of South Africa. And then they will not really do anything that will interfere with the will of the people. So I'm confident because of those two aspects.
Indeed. Professor Everatt, could I ask you to paint a picture of the ANC's performance up to now from 1994 and what kind of broad historical trends we've seen in their electoral performance?
Well, nationally, I mean, the ANC in 1994 didn't do as well as was perhaps expected, 62.7, 63%. It's worth remembering that that was also the first election where Cambridge Analytica was unleashed on South Africa. Wow. We didn't know it at the time, but they were hired by the National Party to go and do dirty tricks. So there were all sorts of things happening there. The ANC under Mbeki steadily climbed to a high of 69 points, but 70%, which is really the era of economic growth, you know, unquestioned majorities. When Jacob Zuma took over, initially he managed to pull a large number of Zulu voters, and it was very ethnicized, out of Inkatha and into the ANC. 5 years later, they all trooped back, and the ANC dropped quite significantly. When Cyril Ramaphosa came in, it was in the new dawn, the optimism of change, and he held the ANC up to a 54.5%, 55%. And right now, I don't think any poll has said that the ANC will breach the 50% mark. We're all putting it below.
Yeah, indeed. Ms. Magubane, it's an interesting period because, of course, the big question is, will the ANC fall below 50? But what we've also seen is, because there's so much at stake in this election, it feels like a very charged atmosphere. We've heard jibes being thrown at the IEC. There's talk of foreign interference, whether from the West or the global South. What do you make of some of the rhetoric that has been coming out of various political parties about prospects of this election being interfered with on the one hand, and the IEC not being up to standard, particularly with the recent leak?
I'm glad you actually started there, because I think this is one of the very first times in our history of elections that there's been a premature leak of any party's candidate list. And the 285 names that are on that list, of course, we saw some names which raised some eyebrows, and they left the ANC on the back foot, having to explain the likes of the Malusi Gigabas, the Zizi Kodwas, and of course we know that the SG of the ANC had said that because they had not completed the process of going through the disciplinary processes internally, that they still qualified to be in that national list. But to come to your question about the rhetoric that's been coming out, we see a lot of it each and every election year. So in terms of the charged environment that we see, it's going to be daggers out. It's going to be blood on the floor. But I think, like Terry was saying, there's a nervousness this time around, and with good reason. This will be the first time, if the polls and the surveys are anything to go by, that the ANC goes below 50%, which will then lead us into a coalition government. And of course, we know that smaller parties have started preparing themselves for this, through like the multi-party charter, which we know the ACDP has just recently joined, taking it from 7 to 8 parties who've banded together, and they're saying that should South Africa move into a coalition government, that they will work together to oppose the ANC and any other parties the ANC may go into a coalition with. But I think perhaps more worrying is the legislative frameworks of coalitions, which are not well developed in this country.
Absolutely.
We know that lawmakers and the promulgation processes of parliament are still at an early stage, where they are doing fact-finding missions in other countries that are running on coalitions, countries like Italy, countries like the DRC,
right,
that have so many coalitions working. But if the coalition example at a municipal and local level is anything to go by, then we know that our own political stability in the country is at risk if we go into a coalition government that has no electoral or has no act attached to it. We have the Electoral Act, we have this Act. Yeah,
indeed. Let me just bring in Mr. Hartley to his perspectives, because I think you've raised a number of very interesting issues already about the election as we set the scene. Mr. Hartley, I know that you're obviously at the Brenthurst Foundation, heading up their research arm right now. But I mean, you've been observing elections for a very long time too. As we set the scene, what are your thoughts on this election, and to what extent do you think this election differs from other elections? How special do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, South Africa since 1948 has been ruled by a dominant party. I mean, there was the National Party under apartheid, and now you have the ANC for the last 3 decades. So the fact that there will no longer be a party with a majority, I think that's very likely, does change the game. I think it's positive in the sense that there is growing political competition, and political competition is an essential ingredient of democracy. It makes everybody better. the fear of losing power would make the ANC better, and the desire to gain power would make the opposition better. So I do think that dynamic is very healthy for South African politics going forward, and it's different to the dominant party and the always minority opposition scenario that we've been living with for a long time.
Indeed, and in terms of the ANC's performance up to now, can you help us just get the context of this election and exactly where we are in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it enters the realm of speculation. We've done 3 polls. We did one in September 22, we did one in October last year, and we've just done one now in February. And what you've seen is the ANC shedding quite a lot of votes between 2022 and 2023, and then still losing more votes. They dropped to 41% in October last year, and from there to 39% now. So I think the October last year scenario, I suspect, was very influenced by load shedding, which was very intense because we had an entire year of serious load shedding,
right,
almost every. I think there were only 3 or 4 days where there was no load shedding, and that I think was a very big. I think it shook voters in quite a big way.
Right.
And I suspect that may be behind that particular fall. I also think that the departure of the radical economic transformation faction from the ANC, the Ace Magashule leaving, taking his supporters with him and others, the fact that Willem Kiezer, was stepped down from the leadership, the fact that Jacob Zuma was shuffling into an opposition role, all of these things have eroded the ANC's vote.
Right.
And quite in the last survey,
let's leave it there for now. Apologies for the interruption, because we're going to have to cut to our first break, but we will come back to some of those key questions that our panelists have raised this evening. We've set the scene, and when we come back, we're going to look at some of the data that's been produced recently and where that leaves the ANC for the upcoming election. Stick with us.
The ANC is not held at ransom by its members. The ANC is following the due processes that affect each and every individuals who themselves have got rights. So there's nothing that is fudged or put under the carpet and not been addressed by the National Executive Committee. I've given you a full account that we've had 20 people who appeared on the Zondo Commission from NEC members who retired and some of them who are serving. Of that 20, we had 6. Of these 6, only appear on the ANC 2024 candidate list.
ANC SG Fikile Mbalula there, and the question on everyone's lips this election is this a watershed election? Could the ANC fall below 50%? And we have just been setting the scene in the segment before this with the historical performance of the ANC, what is at stake in this election. And now we come to some of the data that has been produced of late, which paints an interesting picture of a declining ANC, but of course, some time to go in the election. Professor Everatt, can I start with you again, because you were part of a really interesting poll that was recently released that spoke about the national picture. Could you give us some insight into what that poll suggested?
Sure. I was asked by Change Starts Now to run a poll for them. Change, which seems to have stopped now. And we did a very large sample survey, a 9,000 sample survey. And the importance of doing it our way is we interview people in their homes, in their own language, face to face, so that everyone in South Africa has an equal chance of being interviewed. And I think the randomness of the sample gives us confidence in the results. The ANC is not hitting above 60% in any province in the country. which if you think about Limpopo, which used to be up in the 92s, 93s, is shocking. It's highest in the Limpopo and the Eastern Cape. But as you come down, it's really faltering. Obviously it's always done badly in the Western Cape, but it's sitting on about 26% in our survey. I think the Brenthurst may have it lower in KZN. And we were too early to ask a question about the MK party. Yeah. But we had a large number, about 28% of respondents who didn't want to tell us who they were going to vote for. And I think that was MK not declaring. So I think in Gauteng, ANC sitting on 35, they're going to really battle. I think one thing we have to be aware of is the ANC will still be the dominant party. It will still be the largest party. It will still be it won't be a majority party, but it will be a dominant party. It will dictate the terms of coalitions that it enters. Because it'll have the numbers. And I think one thing that's worth observing is even though obviously a huge number of people have either turned away or are just not going to vote, the ANC remains the mothership. It's the party that people want to vote for, and what they tell us in focus groups is that the ANC has made it impossible to do so. So they point to the RDP house they've got and any number of things that have been delivered. And their line is if only the ANC was not as corrupt as it is, they would be voting for them. And I think, unlike what Ray was saying earlier, what our survey found was that overwhelmingly the number one issue is unemployment. And if you remember 1994, when I was doing this for the ANC's poster was jobs, jobs, jobs. And unfortunately that's come right back to haunt them now.
I mean, the numbers are so striking that some have just chosen to deny them, but some people have criticized the poll, particularly for not allocating those undecided voters. How do you respond to that?
You know, it's a choice of a pollster. I think a poll such as ours, which fieldwork was done in November, December, I think to try and either reallocate or impute, which I'll explain if you want, but that far out from election day and try and pretend, oh look, this is the result, I think it's just silly. You know, manifestos hadn't been launched, campaigns hadn't started, all sorts of, MK didn't exist. So, you know, all sorts of things will happen between the first week of December when we came out of field and 29th of May. So a lot of, almost all survey agencies take out people who say, I refuse to tell you, I don't know, and they allocate them to other parties. So the ANC comes out at 39, suddenly it goes up to 41 because you're reallocating. People also do what they call imputing, where they would model people. So they'd say the typical, I don't know, IFP voter is a Zulu-speaking male, probably above 50, probably peri-urban or rural. So anyone who said, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, I refuse to tell you, will automatically be given to the IFP. So to my mind, those are perfectly legitimate things to do, so long as you tell us what was the before and the after. I think when we're presented with a result and people have done the imputation and they haven't told you how many people were moved around, I think those are distinctly dodgy polls. And I think transparency is key in polling.
Absolutely.
And with much of that data, people are smart enough to do the math themselves.
And you did,
it's not a difficult sum. It's just take out the people who are not voting, re-percentage, and all the parties go up.
And you were clear about what you were doing, and I think it presents a picture that people can make calculations about if they want to. And 9,000 people is a dramatic number of people to have covered. So fascinating data. And Mr. Hartley, you, of course, have been much in the public discourse of late because of the Brenthurst Foundation's recent numbers. Can you give us the headline there in terms of the national picture? Of course, this is a much more recent poll, and what it's telling us right now.
Yeah, it has the ANC at 39%, and as David said, remains the largest party and will be the one with the sort of first shot at forming a coalition. And that I think will be an interesting process in itself. And then you have the DA at 27 and MK, the third largest, at 13%, which is larger than the EFF. So I think the EFF is down from 17 to 10 in our poll. And I think a lot of those votes have gone to the MK party. And I think also the IFP has suffered quite badly at the hands of the MK party. So, the scenario there, if you put the parties of the MPC together, you get 33%. So they're still smaller than the ANC at 39%.
Right, and same question to you. Some have questioned the use of telephonic polling and not accounting for income. Of course, you do control for other variables. Do you think that the fact that this was a telephonic poll, although you did use the random number method, might be skewing that somewhat?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly expensive process, and we just don't have the resources really to go and do a nationwide interview-based poll on a scale large enough to be, to stand up. So
Sure.
The telephone call it's a 15-minute interview, and it's designed to try and get a proper interaction with the interviewee. So I think South Africa's cell phone penetration is extremely high, and you do actually reach almost all the demographics with a cell phone poll. So we're reasonably confident that it would be good.
Right. No, some fascinating data, and of course there have been various other polls. Ms. Magubane, I wonder what you make and how you interpret this. These numbers would make for worrying reading in the ANC, I imagine. What do you make of these quite startling polls?
I assume that the ANC is looking at all of these polls and what's coming out, and the figures, and they're going into their war room, and they're using that to base their strategy for elections and campaigning to say, how do we turn this around? However, we know that there's a number of reasons why the polls are stating what they are, which is, below 50%. We can look at issues of voter apathy, right? We can look at issues of the emergence of new parties. And what the MK has done has been quite interesting, because we know that the presence of former President Jacob Zuma as the front of the party has really done a lot for them to just pool the numbers behind them. But I think as much as the projections show that the MK party will chip away support from the IFP, from the ANC, what is still missing from the public eye is just who the public office bearers of the MK are, outside of President Jacob Zuma, whose face is going to be on the ballot papers come election day, because the former president has said he's still a member of the ANC, even though his own party has kicked him out. And as far as I know, he's not publicly declared himself as the number one, face of the party. So I think that in the absence of a face that people can put a face to, in the way that people put faces, like a Malema to EFF, a John Steenhuisen to, the DA and Patriotic Alliance, we've got the guys of Gayton Mackenzie. I think that interaction of one-on-one, because election is also very emotional. People make emotional decisions when they cast their votes, because they vote according to who speaks their language in terms of what their needs are. And if we look at the numbers of who's most likely to be voting in these elections, we can only just draw from what the Chief Electoral Officer Simon Mabolo released just like some 2 days ago. He certified the voters roll, and we have 27.7 million South Africans who now qualify to vote in the upcoming elections. Of that number, a few highlights that have come out is that for the first time, we have a dramatic increase from 18 to 39 years old. Is now sitting at 42% of the voters roll. So we've definitely seen an uptake of young people coming, forward to register, and they've cited the online registration portal as having been one of the reasons why young people are voting or are registering to vote, because they don't have to queue, go to a school, they can do it online because they live in the world of technology. Women, for the first time, are over 50% of the voters roll, at 55%, and at about 11 million voters. So you can see what the demographics are looking at. So if parties are not speaking to young people and women, chances are they're not going to perform well.
Absolutely. We've been discussing some of the recent data. I have excused Mr. Tselane from having to weigh in on too many political issues, but we're coming back after this break to mine his insights about what it means, whether the increased contestation has any bearing on the actual management of the election. And we'll also look at some provincial dynamics, because there are some fascinating provincial races in this election that maybe have been obscured in the national conversation. So do stick with us for some further insights. Fellow South Africans, we have a massive election coming up. It is potentially a watershed election, and tonight we're asking, could the ANC fall below 50%, as many pollsters and analysts have suggested they might? Of course, there's much time to the election, and what the implications of that might be. We've looked at the historical picture of ANC performance. Of course, the ANC has dominated South African elections up to this point. We looked at some of the recent polls in the previous segment, and now we want to delve deeper into our discussion around some of the debates that are already emerging in our panel, but also some of the provincial dynamics in this election. Before we do that, I believe we're generating quite the discussion on social media. So let's take a few of your comments, and we'll also put those into the mix of our conversation. Poverty is all I know says, nope, the ANC will poll closer to 60%, if not above. Looking forward to watching your show post-election. Right, and we have Muzi saying ANC is going to surprise all of you in that studio. 54% is for the ANC. And the final comment. Right, I believe we are going to leave it there with the social media comments for now, but there'll be a few more later on. So, Mr. Tselane, I don't know if there's anything out of the debate so far that you'd like to pick up on, but of course, without necessarily wading into the politics, one thing that comes to mind is the more contested an election and the more we get closer to an incumbent that has been in power for a very long time, possibly falling below 50%. In some ways, the more is at stake and the more scrutiny goes onto election management. Do you think that that added pressure is something that, you know, could be problematic for the IEC?
Of course, it is going to be an added burden and pressure on the Commission, because the more contestation you have, the more pressure on the Commission, because quite a number of political actors will expect the Commission to behave in a particular way. And therefore, there will be accusation and counter-accusation against the Commission. Of course, what they've got to do is to make sure that they stand firm in terms of the management of this process and understand the atmosphere within which these elections are taking place, and make sure that at the end of the day they manage this process with integrity. There is a matter that I wanted to comment on.
Absolutely.
Which relates to a party. I've had this notion before that a party with the largest number of votes should determine a government. It's a problematic idea because it is not legal, it is not based on any legal arrangement, nor constitutional arrangement. When Parliament meets, the parties there are going to be using what we refer to as the first past the post system, which means the one that gets 50 plus 1 is the one that takes over. And you'll find this within section 86 of the Constitution that says, at its first sitting, the National Assembly will choose from amongst itself a man or a woman who will become the president. You know, so there is no one who's going to be sitting there and saying, the party with the largest number of votes must actually determine. Everybody will be jockeying for position, and if you can master 50 plus 1, even if you're part of 2% party, but you are able to get support from all other parties, and you are able to get 50 plus 1, you will definitely be able to choose the president in terms of the Constitution. You know, so I thought I should clarify this particular issue because it's a constitutional issue, and it is there, and there is no other way of avoiding
Absolutely, and may well be the debate in our politics after the election. Prof, what do you think of that? Because, as you rightly suggested, the ANC is still going to be the major political force in our politics, even if it falls below 50. But does that give it the legitimacy to lead governments necessarily?
Oof, legitimacy is a tough one. It will have earned the right to do what it can do if it's at 39 or 41. It'll have to look for a fairly significant party to go into a coalition with, because that's quite a big gap. If it campaigns really well and something happens and it comes out at 47, 48, it just has to pull in a couple of 1% parties and it's there. I mean, good around Patricia de Lille still in cabinet, etc. So I think the point is not that it's a legal or constitutional given, it's a political given. You can't get around a party that's sitting on 39% unless you get a really unholy alliance of parties that loathe each other and get together purely to keep the ANC out, which is conceivable, but it's also, I think, a recipe for disaster. And I don't see, for example, the DA and EFF getting together on the basis of an anti-ANC ticket. So if the ANC is coming in anywhere between 39, 40, 41, it can dictate the terms. You're absolutely right, it's not a given, but you can't avoid a party that's that dominant.
Mr. Hartley, any thoughts from you on this? But could I also just throw a further thing into the mix here, which is the provincial dynamics in this election, because there's a lot of focus on the national picture, but it seems to me that there are 5, if not 6, provinces that really hang in the balance if we look at least the provincial results, and I appreciate that there aren't technically provincial results in a local election, but if you take the totality of provincial results in the most recent local election, there are 5 or 6 provinces that are really in play here, where we could see either a change in government or at least not one party having full control.
Yeah, I think in particular Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, there is unlikely to be a clear winner there. And in KwaZulu-Natal, the MK party is at 25%, the largest party, which I think was quite a surprise. And in Gauteng, the ANC and the DA are sort of close to each other, 34 thereabouts. So that province will also likely have a coalition government. But I think these provincial coalitions are likely to be shaped by what happens at national level and the trade-offs that are made there. So, for example, the ANC could get together with the MK party and make a deal with Jacob Zuma that he could perhaps be the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal in exchange for pushing them over the line in the national poll. And I mean, that's not inconceivable. There's a lot of very bad blood there at the moment. And there might be some debate and so on about, and division within the ANC over it. But it is conceivable. I mean, he is a former president as a member of the ANC. And the EFF is in a similar sort of bargaining position, although it doesn't have a dominant province that it could rule in if there was as a trade-off for bringing its support to the national level. So those are some of the dynamics that are there. And of course, the ANC also, there is the possibility of looking as David said, towards the center, because depending on how far below 50% it is, it could easily form coalitions with a number of the centrist small parties. And in some scenarios, in some people's minds, perhaps even the DA hasn't been ruled out altogether, although that would be done, as they say in Afrikaans, met lang tande. But so there's a lot up in the air. There's a lot of possibilities that could still shake out.
There's no doubt that whichever result we get, someone is going to be swallowing a porcupine, as they say. Ms. Magubane, 5 provinces, maybe 6 in play, and I think this is something that maybe hasn't been focused on because we fixated on the national picture. Of course, the Western Cape is interesting. Gauteng and KZN are very interesting, but then you've got Free State, you've got the Northern Cape, and maybe even the Northwest. And so maybe one of the stories after this election might not be so much about what happens nationally, but the swings that happen in provinces away from a political picture that has been dominated by the ANC to one where the ANC is still the major player, but lots of provincial dynamics could come into play after the 29th of May?
I think it's very important to look at the provincial play, because I'm of the opinion that the biggest headache of the ANC is really at a provincial level, where there's a dominance of other parties. And there's a number of reasons why this will be, a big problem for them, because obviously we know that when we're sitting at province, we're sitting at provincial legislatures, we're sitting at miniature parliaments, that have the similar makeup to national, and the parties that have the most seats, have a swing in the voting when it comes to budget allocations, when it comes to the allocation of MEC positions, when it comes to all of those processes. The parties that have the most seats have the biggest say. But I think we also have to look at it from a political make-up system. We know that the function of provinces is very much part of a decentralization. And when you look at decentralized states, South Africa is a democratized, decentralized state, which simply means that the functions and the resources of the center are decentralized into the provinces, which are made up of elected representatives that are supposed to take the functions of national and bring them closer to the people. But we also look at policy. When a party implements policy at a government level, because it's ruling, you're expecting it not only to do so at a national level, but to follow through at a provincial and all the way down to a local level. But when you have parties that have different policies that are running different provinces, then you have a bit of a schizophrenic picture, because each party brings its own policies. As much as we have municipal laws, as much as we have guiding principles, but each party has its own vested interest. Let's take the KZN case study, for instance. The IFP has made it very clear when they launched last week that they want to run the KZN government. However, we know that the MK is a big headache for them. But if we look at the fact that they're currently managing big municipalities like King Cetshwayo, like Ulundi municipalities, Umhlatuze, where they have even won municipal awards, funny enough, for running those municipalities well. They are showing themselves to be a government in waiting.
Right. And
for the IFP to be growing at the rate that it is at the moment is definitely going to be an eyesore for the DA, who themselves, are wishing to have quite a lot of dominance in the province. And we've seen Action SA putting, in fact,
Indeed,
the number of manifestos that have been launched in KZN. Moses Mabhida was the place to be.
Yeah.
How many election manifestos were released at Moses Mabhida? But that shows you how important that province is.
Let's leave it there. We're going to come back to our final segment after this and ask what could change between now and the election, because polls are certainly not predictions, they're snapshots in time, and there's still a lot of game to be played in this election. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. It's the election that everyone has been talking about. 30 years into our democracy, we face the potential of a watershed poll, and this evening we've been exploring it from multiple different angles, from the history to current polling, from the national to the provincial picture. And in this final segment, we're going to ask, what could change, and what are the unexpected game changers that could still be in our path in this election, and of course tie up any loose ends in our debate and discussion. Mr. Hartley, can we start with you in this segment? And I suppose the question is, firstly, I saw some of the comments on social media saying that all of you on the panel would be eating humble pie after the election. Firstly, I think only 2 of you have spoken about polls. But secondly, no one has purported that these are predictions. So, what do you think could change, and what that could change could make things look better for the ANC in the final months going into the election, such that, it may cling on to that 50 or go beyond it even?
Yeah, I think that, if you look at the big issues for the electorate, as David said, unemployment is number 1, corruption is number 2, and at number 3 is load shedding. And I mentioned load shedding earlier because, while the other 2 factors, you're very unlikely to be able to turn those around in the 2 months remaining before the election, especially if you've got people implicated from the Zondo Commission on your list and so on. And unemployment is a much longer cycle. It's going to be hard to show any results by the end of May. However, load shedding is a swing factor. You can ameliorate load shedding. You know, when we had the BRICS meeting in town, the lights were on. So there are ways of doing that, running the diesel full tilt, kind of holding off on scheduled maintenance.
Maybe we should give BRICS leaders a permanent holiday in South Africa.
Yeah. I suspect the ANC could, because the public memory is very short when it comes to these things, and a couple of weeks of light load shedding, people will think we're over the worst of it. And the ANC is quite clever, because the electricity minister said that he won't need a job by the end of the year. We've turned the corner. It's all coming right. It's going to be sorted out. And so they're actually playing that card quite well.
Yeah.
I think the other factor is just the election machinery and the resources that the ANC has will apply in the next 2 months are going to be substantial. And it is a very good campaigning party. And I think you would expect it to pull quite a few percentage points back ahead of the election.
Indeed. Ms. Magubane, your thoughts on anything that, could change this picture in the months ahead?
Well, of course, I think the big change could be the final results that no one expected. And we all know that the ANC wants to prove everybody wrong, to say not only are we going to have a majority, but we're also going to have a convincing majority. And I assume that it's all systems go within Luthuli House, to be campaigning. Yep. But I think another finding that could be quite interesting is how the newer parties perform. The likes of your Rise Mzansi, your Busas, all of those parties that have really come in with a very strong impetus, and the MK, of course, that have really come in as new players. And I believe this is also Action SA's first, big elections.
National, yeah.
And as a new kid on the block, they didn't perform very well in the last local government elections, but they've learned a lot between then and now. And Mashaba has solidified his position in a number of provinces. So I think that the emergence of those parties at a provincial level and a big player could also be, someone that we don't expect, in the terms of an independent candidate, which is something we haven't spoken about tonight, that unlike most elections, people are going to get 3 ballot papers this year. And one of those is going to be voting for independent candidates, which of course was enabled by a constitutional court ruling, that said that it was unconstitutional that they couldn't run. So the performance of those independent candidates for me would be another unexpected result that I'm waiting to see, especially in your smaller outlying provinces where they could have, permanent or I would say coalition power with other parties.
Absolutely. Prof, what are your thoughts on, what the last 2 months of an election mean? And here we need to start bringing our own interpretations and analysis in beyond the data, in terms of what the ANC's performance might look like and what this election might look like.
So, the ANC always polls low, a long way out from the election. Almost all parties do, but it has historically polled very low. And it is the campaign machinery that turns that around. Yep. It's never come in this low. And to make up kind of 11% just to hit 50 is a very big, very well-resourced campaign. And I'm not convinced the ANC is as well-resourced as it used to be. Many of those donors have moved off into other, and we've seen the billionaires are all funding these small parties. I think 2 points. None of the small parties are polling well. Most of them are not showing up at all. Rise isn't showing. Bosa isn't showing. Bosa is on 1%. Patriot Alliance on 1%. They really are the 1% parties. And I think local government elections is where they will actually show. But I also think that, power focuses attention very quickly. And I think that whatever the national, the center of all the parties tries to dictate, when you have the prospect of power or the prospect of losing power, all sorts of unholy alliances will be formed. And I think, I mean, Ray hinted earlier about one between MK and the ANC, which is quite shocking. But just as easily, you could have the IFP and the DA getting together. I think the party we're not talking about is the EFF. And in our poll, they seem to be growing slowly, but growing, kind of 1 or 2%. But MK seems, because it's quite a boisterous party, it's taking that thunder away from we're not afraid to speak the truth, we're not afraid to use physicality when we have to. And I think the EFF's in quite a lot of trouble now, because if you look at the leadership figures, Malema in particular is an incredibly divisive leader, and he repels more than he attracts. And I think that's really beginning to put a ceiling on what the EFF can achieve. And I think they had great hopes for this election. I'm not sure they're going to get what they wanted.
Mr. Tselane, what are your thoughts that come from this debate, and, you know, what we need to be looking out for in the months leading up to this election, which is drawing ever closer?
I think one point that is important is that, sorry, as I indicated earlier on, South Africa uses a proportional representation system. And it was always an anomaly to find one dominant party in a proportional representation system. And we're beginning to see now a shift towards coalition. And what the country's got to do is to begin to prepare now for regulation of coalition, so that we don't have the kind of the difficulties and challenges we have in the municipalities. There's got to be a proper framework. And unfortunately, we don't have much time. Many of the politicians and political parties are going to be taken by surprise when the election results are announced. And now, quickly, they've got to find a way not only of forming coalitions, but of having to make sure that they can create stable coalitions to be able to govern the country. So it's going to take time before you can actually be able to do so.
It's such an important point, because our focus is right now on the election, but of course May 29th will come and the results will follow. And you know, we had a conversation on this show about the way that other countries manage coalitions, and I was quite shocked at how elaborate the actual legal regulations are, and how we are almost flying blind into this election without really any regulations on how coalitions work. And in fact, some pressures that coalitions have to come together quite quickly. So we're going to be in a position of little regulation and no time.
Absolutely, that's going to be a big problem. And I think the obsession in South Africa, in quite a number of areas, as we have seen in the municipalities, is around giving people positions. Remember that these positions, these political parties, when they come into coalition arrangement, they all come with their manifestos. And because they're coming with their manifestos, there is an expectation from their constituencies that they will implement their manifestos. Now you come in and you are given a particular portfolio. You try to implement your manifesto in that portfolio. And another one is trying to implement their own manifesto. So you've got a lack of coherence in terms of governance. And you're already seeing it in the municipalities, where you've got Patriotic Alliance having its own MMC managing things in their own way. You've got the ANC managing things in their own way. Another one. At the end of the day, you've got a strategic focus. You need a strategic focus for governance. And then if you're just focusing on positions, you're losing one critical aspect. What is going to be the strategic focus of a governance structure? So that is going to be the challenge going forward. It's not just about positions. It's about creating a strategic framework for governance in all the areas where there will be coalitions.
Indeed. We have a minute left for our other three panelists to close out their thoughts. Ms. Magubane, if I could ask you to be brief so we can also hear from our other two panelists.
So I think that in closing, what I'm looking forward to seeing is whether the numbers that were presented to us, the 27.7 eligible voters, will become, you know, the numbers that we will see at the end of the day, because we know that voter apathy has been one of the biggest factors that have put us in the coalition structure. And I also want to see, like Terry is saying, how they're going to run coalitions at a national level. I mean, if we have a president today from one party and then they're gone tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of political instability in the country. So
Absolutely.
stabilizing the country for me is what I'm looking to see within a coalition context. Will we have that going forward? I don't know.
Prof. Everatt, any final closing thoughts?
I mean, I think Terry made a really, really good point. So, I mean, I would like to echo that. I think, buckle up, it's going to be quite a ride. My sense is that the ANC is going to close the gap a lot. I think its campaign machinery is better than anyone else's in the country. And I think it's easily going to creep up to 46, 47%, and above 50 in many of the provinces where it's looking a bit shaky, the ones that you were mentioning. I think in a number of those it'll hit the 50% mark. So I think a lot of the excitement we're having now will fade away, but I think the point remains, power will focus their attention, and without that framework to govern coalitions, provinces can do what they want. Who's going to tell them not to? And I think we should watch out for that.
Mr. Hartley, to close off.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just on a positive note, it's not scary, it's democracy. There is political competition growing in the country. This is healthy. This makes everybody better. And, I just hope that the polls do not get dragged down into some sort of violent confrontation, which some of the parties have begun to threaten.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, to all my panelists, for a fascinating conversation from many different perspectives and sources of expertise. We're all wondering what's going to happen in this year's election. Will it be a watershed election? And how will these last few months of the campaign unfold? This evening we've given you various perspectives on the history of elections, current polling, the provincial picture, and also a reminder that there's still a lot to play for. So let's continue this conversation on social media at Unfiltered SABC. And thanks for joining us for another installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.